welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. We have Alice Driver. She's a James Beard award winning writer from the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas. She's the author of More or Less Dead and the translator of Abecedario de Juárez. And in 2024, she won the Lukas Work in Progress Prize from Columbia Journalism School and the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard for her newest book, The Life and Death of the American Worker. The Immigrants taking on America's largest meatpacking company. And today we'll be discussing, absolutely, and today we'll be discussing The Life and Death of the American Worker, which will be available September 3rd. Alice, it's a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited since my book comes out in 2 days.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And as we tend to do, we're going to start off with a passage from the book.
Yeah.
So Alice wrote, "Death in the meatpacking industry can be slow and even boring. A series of interactions in which medical coverage is denied to a worker or a visit to a doctor is not approved. As companies like Tyson have shifted to using apps and artificial intelligence to interact with workers, the party responsible for disabling or killing a worker has become nameless and faceless. Who is responsible for the death of a worker in the age of artificial intelligence? While the bureaucratic inner workings of Tyson may seem too dull to be of interest, workers' lives hang in the balance. Tyson builds its plants in small rural towns, becoming the primary source of employment for residents, most of whom are immigrants. It's estimated that undocumented workers make up between 30 to 50% of the meatpacking workforce. Latinx workers like Placido and Angelina make up 34.9% of the meatpacking workforce, greater than the percentage of African Americans, whites, or Pacific Islanders employed. Meatpacking is one of the most dangerous jobs in the U.S., with an average of 27 workers a day suffering amputation or hospitalization. For immigrants and refugees who have little schooling or are illiterate, it is one of the few jobs that pays above minimum wage." So, Alice, I want to ask you kind of a more basic question to get the conversation going. So, you actually started researching Tyson way back when in 2011. So, can you actually tell us a little bit about the background, why you chose Tyson, what was going on at the time, getting into the chemical spill, and then obviously, as we're going to kind of go through it, I don't want to ask you too many questions, but we're going to get into COVID. But let's just talk about the beginnings in 2011, why this became of interest to you.
Okay, I'm going to go back even farther to my birth because I'm from the Ozark Mountains, and the Ozark Mountains is the home of Tyson Foods, which is the largest meatpacking company in the United States. And so I grew up in rural Arkansas, and I grew up around, surrounded by chicken houses, surrounded by people either working at Tyson, on the line, cutting chicken, or growing chickens, because there's a whole chain of, they integrate all of the activities involved with, in this case, in Arkansas, it's, processing chicken. And so it's something that I was, aware of. And once I became a journalist, I always wanted to be a writer, but I started looking at issues really at the intersection of food systems and labor. And it seemed like a natural project for me to write about Tyson. And also for me, even though I grew up around, for example, people who worked at Tyson, I knew nothing about their lives in the sense that they're afraid. I mean, come to Arkansas and see if anybody wants to talk to you about Tyson, and you'll find out how hard it is. And so I thought, if I want to know about their lives, I'm sure that other people do, because this is a huge part of our culture, of our country. I mean, the role that meat plays in terms of diets, in terms of, even in this presidential election, has played a role. And so I'm a freelancer, and I didn't have anybody interested in this topic until the pandemic hit in 2020.
Yeah, which makes sense, right? I mean, first of all, that was the time we were all supposed to be social distancing. A lot of people were working remotely, but people who were working in the meatpacking industry, I mean, obviously you can't afford to work remote. I mean, you got to keep the supply chain going of meat and other sorts of products. So then you got to really put a lens on, oh, how is the company treating these people? Like, especially if they're dealing with COVID, if they're people who are sick with COVID, are they allowed to stay home? Do they only get a week like they do in the book, for example? Are they told if other people working next to them have COVID or had COVID, and to just kind of be alert about that? People were really scared around that time, and it makes sense to like totally kind of put a lens on that industry during that time.
And you make a really good point, because one of the things that was interesting to me, that there's corporate Tyson, you know, the people who work as managers and supervisors and are in the office. Corporate Tyson during the first year of the pandemic was sent to work from home.
Wow.
You know, to keep you safe, you're all working from home, and corporate Tyson is mostly white. Very few people in positions of power at Tyson are people of color or even women. So meanwhile, all of the line workers were, you know, in order to keep production up, you need every single person to be there.
Yeah. So going back to now 2011. So can we talk about the chemical spill? Tell us what happened and how it was handled.
Well, this was interesting to me because I started interviewing workers in 2020, and I really was focusing on what are labor conditions like during the pandemic. You know, during the first year of the pandemic, what's happening? Is there social distancing? Are workers allowed to quarantine? And all those kinds of questions. And when workers started to get infected with COVID and die of COVID, one of the things that came out of the stories of workers who died was that many of them were also in a chemical accident in 2011 at a Tyson plant in Springdale that destroyed either a portion or an entire lung. And that was an issue I hadn't even considered when I started this project, the use of chemicals in meatpacking facilities. Like, if you look at the statistics on chemical accidents, there's a high incidence of chemical accidents, and part of it, and this was at play in the Tyson facility here in Arkansas, was that you have workers, and workers speak up to, let's say, 20 to 50 different languages. And although Tyson says that they provide translators and they provide materials in the language of all of the workers, imagine the translation requirements for example, mixing chemicals. And so what workers said in that incident is that the worker was not able to speak of English, and the instructions for mixing these chemicals, which if mixed incorrectly produce a weapons grade chemical.
Wow.
They were in English. And so Tyson denies that story. But the investigation of the incident, that's what they said what happened. You know, this worker who was, you know, not properly trained and didn't speak English, and then the materials were only in English. And so there's a lot of issues like that which really get down to, and you have people who are illiterate, you know, so how are they serving, you know, that audience as well in terms of safety?
No, for sure. And actually, when reading that part, it really got me. I mean, there's some other stuff I really got to talk about, but in particular. So, for example, I believe the two, and probably they're not their real names in the book, but Angelina and
Angelina, that
Placido.
is her real name, because she doesn't work at Tyson, and anybody who's dead or who doesn't work at Tyson agreed to let me use their name. But
Oh,
anybody who's alive and who still works at Tyson or has family at Tyson said, you know, give me a pseudonym.
absolutely. So, for example, like Placido, right? In particular, the one who had the like one of his lungs damaged. Actually, sorry, let me take it a step back. When the description as the actual uh, chemical sort of the air was being filled with that gas, and kind of like how, and I believe it was Angelina who was um, like first seeing, oh, her throat closed.
Oh, it wasn't, Angelina wasn't there. It was her husband that was there. And then
Okay, so
another worker. Yeah,
my bad. Sorry
that's
about
okay.
sorry. But yeah, but the description of that incident, throat closing, you have to get out of there. There's other people who are also either fainting, trying to get out through a hallway where it's even more condensed there, the gas. Supervisors blocking their way, telling them, no, you have to work, right? Which, by the way, is insane to me, first of all. Like, if there's a gas like spill, no, just let them out, right? But they cared so much about the production there, not letting people, you know, go to the bathroom for longer than 10 minutes, following people around, being just this kind of like super, super strict force, you know, just kind of like being, just trying to be, what is it called? Like a company man, like, you know,
Right,
like
right.
just really make sure everybody's being productive. and not really caring about these people. And then when you actually get to the end of that first shift, where there's people outside, I believe it was over 100 employees, and a lot of them were fainted. There's only like a few ambulances like in the area, so they had to be bussed to like
Mm.
nearby hospitals. Um, the the way the description of the on-site nurse at Tyson also freaked me out, because they would tell somebody like Placido like he's going to go see them, and then tell him, no, you're fine, you know, and then it made him feel crazy, but clearly he's coughing every day.
Can I actually quote about that? Is it
Please,
okay?
yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
Alice writes, this was just amazing.
Mm.
Describing the on-site nurses at the Barry Street plant, Mateo said, nobody does anything if someone complains that their hands hurt. You go to the nurse's office and they tell you to use 2 quarters to buy a pill for your pain. As a supervisor, he witnessed injured workers visit the on-site clinic where they were almost universally told to buy pain medication from a small vending machine. In my opinion, there is a clear example of when a nurse, this is a clear example of when a nurse is not a nurse, he said, referring to the on-site Tyson clinic as a quote unquote black hole of problems. So yeah, let's actually get into this because that's where we pretty much started about kind of death by a thousand cuts. So Alice, can you tell us about what the medical care is actually like for let's actually first talk about some of the kind of abuses, some of the main injuries that tend to happen. What is the medical care like in terms of on-site and off-site? What sort of insurance, medical coverage they have, disability coverage, workers' compensation, and then ultimately, yeah, what is the on-site clinic usually like for these people?
Mhm. And this is a great question because going into this, I did not know, for example, I did not know that Tyson had on-site clinics.
Mhm.
So I was interviewing workers, and let's talk about the, the main basic injuries. One would be, they're really not allowed to go to the bathroom. I mean, technically they are, but because maintaining production requires everybody on the line. And so that is, I mean, I imagine they have some system which just says you have to maintain this number regardless of what you have to do to the workers on the line. So you have people wearing diapers, you have people being, in my book, there's a woman who says she always gets chased when she tries to go to the bathroom, and her supervisor yells at her.
Mm.
So that's one thing, not being able to go to the bathroom and like the indignity of having to wear a diaper, and it moves up from there. You've got the big one is repetitive motion injuries. So many of the workers in my book need carpal tunnel surgery in one of the workers on both hands. And, by the end of the book, she's been fighting for carpal tunnel surgery for years because in the Tyson system, and the interesting thing to me was when I was talking to workers, they said, oh, the Tyson nurse said I'm fine. And I was like, Tyson nurse? Like, what are you talking about?
Mhm.
And then they would say, oh, the Tyson doctor, didn't approve my surgery. And I'm like, what? How can, how can this be happening? And of course, officially Tyson distances itself from, they said, we don't have nurses, we don't have doctors, we have third-party providers.
Mhm.
And so that's a distinction they're like, this is not true, but I'm like, this is how workers see it and talk about it. And so you have carpal tunnel, which is, the truth is that if workers were allowed to switch jobs every so often, that would decrease carpal tunnel. But, because you keep production up by having someone do the same job until their body completely falls apart.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of things that are very preventable, but they do not maximize profits at the cost of workers. And then any kind of an injury with a knife or a blade, they have really large machinery. And one thing that struck me when I was doing this was a worker said, oh yeah, we got this thing about a worker who was decapitated. We got this legal form saying, if I get in this large machine and it comes on, I could be decapitated, and I understand the risks. And so I was, where did that happen? And the worker didn't know, but it was actually at a Tyson plant in Alabama. And what Tyson does legally is when something really a bad injury happens, they then sort of preemptively have workers sign some kind of a document saying, I'm aware that this could happen, and if it does happen to me,
Mhm.
I accept responsibility for it. Even
Wow.
though in the case of that machine lacked a safety. It was not supposed to turn on with a person inside of it. Someone was cleaning it.
Mm.
So there's all these strange situations that I, was like, what is going on here in terms of injuries? And then with knives, you've got people cutting themselves to the bone, getting blood in their eyes, cutting off a finger. Um,
Yeah, and then in terms of outside medical care, so the way that most companies structure it is that you have medical insurance, whatever company you use, and then you obviously see a doctor. A doctor gives you a note, tells the employer what's going on. So how did the company structure it in such a way where it seems like even if you do have medical care outside of it, it kind of, or if it does conflict with the kind of, I guess, internal system, how did they structure it in such a way where they're legally allowed to say, well, this doctor we don't approve of, or we're not going to take this information seriously, but our doctor we will? How is that possible?
well, I don't, I don't understand all the details because I couldn't,
Yeah.
I did interview one nurse about it, but here's what I do know, that workers, their care is paid for if, if the Tyson nurse, the nurse of the third party provider
Mhm.
says, you're approved to get carpal tunnel surgery, or you're approved to see a doctor, they can go see the doctor of the choice of, recommended by the nurse.
Mhm.
So Tyson tries to distance itself from these things, but the workers, so I had, the worker who needed double carpal tunnel surgery. She went to the doctor multiple times and he said, yeah, you do have carpal tunnel surgery in both hands, but you're not approved to have surgery. And so if you're not approved, if you want to get surgery outside of that system, you have to pay for it.
Mhm.
And so that's the barrier if workers want a second opinion, which is the case of Placido, who had lung damage from the chemical accident. For years he didn't go to an outside doctor because he couldn't afford it. And when he finally did, the doctor said one entire lung has been eaten up by the ammonia.
Mhm.
And so by that time he had spent, I don't know, 5 years being told, you're fine. And so the structure of it, they can see an outside doctor, but they have to pay for it.
Mhm.
Um,
Right.
Yeah, and I believe they even discouraged you getting outside medical consultation, if I understood correctly. Like, you, for example, yeah, like you said, yeah, you'd have to get an okay from the nurse to go see another doctor. There was somebody else who had like an infected eye,
mhm,
uh, and she's like, no, here's some Tylenol. Like, I'm just basically, my understanding is that they're legally obligated to do first aid, the nurses, and
mhm,
then if that fails over the course of like 20 something days. By the way, please keep me honest because I'm
mhm,
forgetting some of the details. I don't want to get it wrong.
Mhm.
But yeah, like things like that, it just seemed nuts to me. One thing, by the way, do you have another thing that you wanted to bring up
Go,
before I get
go
into
for it.
this? Okay,
Mhm.
I have to say this. I have to
mhm,
say this. I used to eat Tyson chicken nuggets all the time, all the time. I would go to Costco. I'm in New York, so we have like Costco's, BJ's, all of that, and you get this big bag of Tyson's chicken nuggets, and I loved eating that like almost every day. I don't have it anymore recently for like other reasons, just because it's like processed, whatever. It's a different conversation.
Mhm.
But when I was reading that part where Victor was describing, taking these huge chunks of like frozen meat with cardboard stuck to it, which you don't have the time to remove because that'll mess with production. Flour that has, and this part, keep me honest on, I don't want to get it wrong. I forgot if I believe he said there's weevils in there.
weevils, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. He would text me all the time. He'd be like, "There's weevils. It's disgusting." And then he would send me pictures. He would send me pictures, of just the boxes of meat sitting there. They're on pallets, but then there's all the little, they call it condemned meat. All the stuff that falls onto the floor is like all over. It's
Mhm.
just a very strange scene.
Yeah, and some of the meat that he encountered that was going to be used was purple or just rotten in general. And I'm just thinking about that. And as I was reading it, I actually got sick. I
Mhm.
actually, because I started to think about how much Tyson chicken nuggets I actually consumed over the course of my life. It's actually insane. I've definitely had, it's over 10,000. It has to be over 10,000 because I really used to eat it all the time. Now I'm afraid. But no, I'm kind of messing around. Like I feel fine. I've been to the doctor, but still,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
start
yeah,
to
yeah,
think
yeah,
about these
yeah,
things.
yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, so just wanted to add that part, just the shock of just finding that out while reading. So
Right.
Yeah, well,
yeah.
Victor, I mean, to me, it was interesting because each job, I mean, each worker had such a different job. He worked only in chicken nuggets. And so one day he said, "You want to know the recipe?" And I was like, "Sure, tell me about it." And that's when I was so fascinated with the process, with what he had to say about it, because he had been, making chicken nuggets for something like 10 years. And he was always telling his kids, like, you wanna know the whole truth about about nuggets.
Oh man. Yeah.
Wow.
Scary.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so now going back to the book, going back to the actual workers. So Alice, how did it get to the point where, okay, I assume, I can't say any of this for sure, but I'm going to assume because they're a major multinational corporation, the Tyson probably stuffs Republican coffers. So how did it get to the point where, so on the one hand, you have kind of, the Tea Party Republicans who essentially argue against undocumented immigration. And then you have a company that somehow or other not only just supports it, but in some ways actually fosters it and contributes to it. So can you talk about some of the lawsuits involved, some of the information that you found about it, and how is it possible that they're able to employ and actually, in some ways, obviously coerce so many undocumented immigrants and pretty much to have a system founded on them and their labor?
Well, for me, this was a really important part of the book because, well, in the US, the law states that companies are not responsible for verifying
Oh,
documentation.
wow.
So if, and the best example I have is the worker who needed carpal tunnel surgery in both hands. When she started working at the Tyson plant, this was in Green Forest, she was undocumented and she worked there undocumented with fake, a fake name and fake documents for a decade.
Mhm.
Then she met and married an American and eventually became a resident. And then she worked for another 10 years under her real name with her real documents.
Mhm.
Mm.
And so for me, that was a really interesting story, to say, I'm probably not allowed to speculate, you're not, that's kind of the thing. The law says, you're not responsible
Mhm.
for verifying this. And so it leaves companies open to that kind of hiring. And it's unfortunate to me that we do not recognize the labor that undocumented people are doing in this country. We recognize it, honor it, and also offer people legal pathways, work permits, or whatever it is, because they're clearly here. They're the backbone of our food system, whether it be agriculture or meatpacking.
Hmm. Yeah, and is the thinking there? I'm just thinking about it from the company perspective because I'm wondering, you know, so what's the benefit, right? So is the thinking there? Well, okay, if this is the law, why we should sort of take advantage of it is because, I mean, if this case, if we hire undocumented workers, they would take less pay. Probably there wouldn't be much collective bargaining. None of them are really going to unionize, et cetera.
Yeah, they're scared. They're not, they're not going to unionize. They're very scared, and they're scared to speak because in general, workers are afraid of retaliation. They're afraid of being fired. And for someone who's undocumented, that has repercussions much beyond, oh, I no longer have a job. It could be, I'm then deported, or I have to go back to my home country, or I'm supporting my entire family in my home country. And so it makes workers, you're able to silence them more, I would say.
Yeah, they feel trapped, right? I
Hmm.
mean,
Hmm.
you can't like somebody else, while I was reading, there was a thought that occurred to me, which was quickly shut down. But my first impulse thought was like, oh, why don't they just leave? Is it that hard to try to find like a different job? But then you do have to think about, yeah, one, citizenship, two, who are you supporting? How quick do you think you'll be able to find another job? What kind of payments do you have to make in order to support, uh, you know,
Yep.
just utilities or rent or
And
whatever?
also in these small towns, like these are one of the few employers too.
There you
Hmm.
Yeah.
go. And one of the few employers,
Yeah.
right? So
Mhm.
it's hard to just pivot, right? You're stuck
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
mhm.
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of these individuals who work at Tyson, their entire extended family works there. So some people they wanted to speak to me for the book, but their family did not want them to because, they're worried about repercussions, not just for themselves, but for any other family member who works at the company.
Mhm. Yeah. And then so also then this I really want to get into. So Tyson was also accused of actually bringing in undocumented immigrants. So purposely, right? So it's one thing to say, well, like we don't really have to check or verify information, which is obviously, I mean, that's legal. But then you also have court cases. I mean, I don't want to like ruin it because I want you to tell the story. But can you actually talk about some of the court cases and some of the accusations that actually Tyson was the one who was bringing in these immigrants purposely?
Yeah, they were accused of essentially of recruiting,
Hmm.
recruiting or carrying workers across state lines to get them to plants.
Wow.
And that's something I wish I had, I wish I had the time and the money and the team to investigate further because I think it's something that merits investigation.
Hmm.
And the interesting thing to me is that with COVID, with workers who died, uh, and they're looking for a new labor pool, that, they're not raising wages really. So where are they going now? Children.
Hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, that was incredible. So how is that possible?
Well, so for example, the US Labor Department did a sweeping investigation and which was inspired by a New York Times investigation of child labor in the US. And they found in Arkansas at the Green Forest plant, they found 6 children
Hmm.
working. And I did not, because I was following workers who were organizing a class action lawsuit, I did not get into that, but it's something that I'm interested in researching because Arkansas has recently lowered the age of work to 14.
Hmm.
And the key and interesting part of the Arkansas legislation is that you do not have to verify the age of the child, and you do not need parental consent.
Hmm.
Wow.
Wow. Wait, and then so just so
Interesting.
we're all kind of on the same point, when you say a child, you mean somebody under 14. That's what they
No,
discovered.
it's ages 14 to 16
Gotcha.
but to me, if you don't have to verify someone's age, I
Hmm.
mean,
Right.
what are you opening up for me?
Hmm.
For me, it's kind of like you don't have to verify the documentation.
Right.
Because the child labor that does appear in my book, which is in, chicken catchers in the chicken houses,
Hmm.
they're minors and they're unaccompanied, meaning they came here with no parents.
Hmm.
Mm.
And that's another, they're working as chicken catchers, which is another third party. Tyson separates itself from different parts of the integrated
Right.
labor.
Right.
But I have a feeling if I looked, I would find a lot more of that.
Hmm.
One thing I'm curious about actually is how did Victor get in touch with, or how did you get in touch with Victor in the first place?
So when I started this project, I basically reached out to organizations in Arkansas that work with immigrants because early pandemic, I wasn't going to be interviewing people in person. And I was trying to identify, will anybody talk to me? And I told these organizations, if there's anybody who works in a packing company, because at first I wrote an article that included other companies,
Hmm.
uh, who wants to speak to me, they can be anonymous, and just let me know, and if they're interested, I'll reach out to them.
Hmm.
And so that's how I started to meet workers. And then in my book, I follow workers who are part of Venceremos, which is a organization founded in Arkansas by 16 women who are
Hmm.
poultry workers. And the director, Magali Lacoli, started organizing really in the pandemic around safety issues and really organizing workers. And so I started following these workers who were organizing because I thought this is a powerful, it's not just workers. This is so sad. This is terrible. They
Hmm.
died. This is workers saying, we are going to organize. We are going to ask for the labor conditions that we need to be safe. And we're going to do this work together as workers.
And what I found really like very respectable is, if also if I remember this correctly, is especially in Magali's case, she's like, I we just want justice, right? Like for example, if you guys like we want you guys to get profit and for us to just be able to work, but in like proper conditions. Like
Mhm.
they give them gloves that do not fit them properly. The floor, it has Crisco on it. Like you're literally slipping on the floor. There's blood on the floor. There's other types of particulates. all these kinds of things, plus that 10-minute break thing, how strict they only care about like, just care about these things, and we're happy with you guys making a profit. It's actually very respectable. It's it's not like they're just saying, no, we hate, Tyson, we want the
Mhm.
company to fail.
Right.
So that's kind of cool. One thing I just have to say though, when I actually got up to the part in the book, and I can't wait for other people to get up to this part, so maybe I won't totally blow it, but Victor in particular, like carrying. All right, I'll say it. When we find out that he's carrying around a pen that records the audio of like what kind of conversations like people are having around. I don't know why, because I've been in jobs where like I would have loved to do something like this, but yeah, he has a pen, he's recording all these different conversations, even ones that like that he decided to record on his own, like
Mhm.
it wasn't planned. And I don't know, there was something cool about that, just from like having been an employee before. It's like, this is kind of
Espionage.
sneaky. This is like,
Mhm.
yeah, espionage, So
Mhm.
yeah, just a little fun
Yeah,
part I
and
enjoyed.
he's
Yeah.
he's really the hero of the book. I mean, in a lot of ways, because
Yeah.
he said no one would believe this if I didn't record it.
Mhm.
And, and he did it when it happened. I was interviewing him one day and he said, "Oh, I've got all these like audios. Do you want to listen to them?" And I was like, "Oh, sure." And then when I started to listen, I was like, no one is going to believe this. I can't even believe this. Like some of the conversations, the way things were framed in the pandemic, especially uh, telling workers that if they didn't work, they were going to make millions of people were going to starve to death in the
Mm.
United States.
Yeah, wow. Yeah. And then so I just want to kind of circle back a bit. So I want to go back to the child labor part. So the thing here is that and I think this might vary state to state. I'm not exactly sure, but I can say at least speak for New York, right? When we do internships here as like college students. So what happens is there's like somewhat I mean whatever, you can call it a quid pro quo, but like everybody benefits. So when you do an internship here, even though you're most likely doing it for free, there's college credit involved. They call it a learning experience. I mean, I've done internships before several times, and it's like, technically speaking, you don't do much work. I mean, you're mostly kind of just like helping out a little bit here and there.
Mhm.
You're kind of learning about the environment. You're mostly with the supervisor all day. They're kind of just showing you around, telling you about the place. And it's more or less like a decent experience. It's not anything that, I mean, people tend to hate it depending on the placement, but usually for the most part, internships feel like they're somewhat fair. So what would, according to the child labor law here in Arkansas, what would the benefit be for a 14 to 16-year-old when there's no credit involved, I assume, to working at a Tyson plant?
Well, the Arkansas law says that, that children aren't allowed to work in hazardous places, so they're not supposed to be at Tyson. But for me, the law has opened the door, because if the law was serious about, it's framed as, oh, it's so great for children to learn responsibility, as if they were all selling ice cream.
Mhm.
But the truth is that a lot of children are working, I mean, in some part of the meatpacking chain, whether that be as a chicken catcher or in sanitation. Those are the two main areas.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And if the law was serious about providing opportunities for children, they would check the age of the child and they would require parental consent. It's kind of like taking off the guardrails, being like, whatever happens, happens.
Right. Right. And I'm assuming the wages for them are much lower if there are any.
Yeah, well, the chicken catchers in my book who are I think they're 14 or 16, they had their wages withheld, and they don't speak English, and then they never got paid, and then they sought help and advice in order to get their wages.
Hmm.
And actually, I don't know if they ever got them. Like, I haven't found out that part.
Hmm. And what is the thinking there? So are they withheld until they're 18, or is it something else?
I don't know, because so much of this, I have no access to
Wow.
I have no access to the Tyson side of things. Like if they can, it's this getting even one small piece of information for this book was an odyssey.
Hmm. Yeah.
And where was OSHA in all of this in terms of regulation, and how Tyson is treating their workers, or the conditions of the industry?
Right.
Well, OSHA is understaffed,
Yeah.
and John Oliver, the comedian, did an amazing segment on meatpacking where
Yeah.
he pointed out that if OSHA staff were going to visit and inspect every facility in the United States, it would take 160 years.
Wow.
And
Wow.
so it's a problem that can be solved. Like, let's fund and staff OSHA, and let's also, fines need to be so great that, that you're not going to injure or kill workers, because the fines are they're so low, like in terms of overall profits, and it's kind of like a slap on the wrist.
Right. Right. And then you also mentioned, and I like that you mentioned the tidbit about the Clintons, so that prison labor is actually employed here. So, and you mentioned that the Clintons actually did something similar in their home in Arkansas. So what's interesting about that? Well, here's the question that I would have about that. So if they are able to employ prison labor, how would that how would that then affect the wages of, let's say, just the average worker, the normal worker there? Because if they can just say something along the lines of like, well, based on the contract that we have with the prison system there, we're able to employ people for X amount, and then so how would that? I just don't understand how that system would work, because at that point that takes away every piece of leverage or every part of the leverage any employee would have there.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's two in Arkansas, and it varies state to state, but in Arkansas, there's two ways that prison labor intersects with Tyson. One is a work release where workers can go work at Tyson.
Hmm.
And my understanding is that the money that they make is then, in a sense, it's held by the prison and used if they have any fines or court fees, so it first goes to cover things, expenses and things.
Hmm.
And the other intersection, which is the one that I did not know about, and I wrote about it because it really surprised me, was that in Arkansas prison, which was the site of a plantation, historically, and has a very high population of Black people imprisoned, is now a farm, and that farm grows corn, and who buys corn? And
Right.
the prison labor that works on the farm in Arkansas, prison labor that works within the prison system receives $0.
Hmm.
So I interviewed, a Black man who had been sent to prison at age 14, which is a whole nother, he was sent to an adult prison, and he spent years growing corn, essentially for Tyson.
Hmm.
Mm.
Wow. And then so how are their wages negotiated there, if you know that?
I mean, there's
Right.
so much,
Yeah.
when I was writing this book, I wish I had a team of 25 people,
Hmm.
because there was so much that I needed and wanted to do and was unable to do.
Right, right. Because it seems like to me, and not to call out anybody specifically, but this does happen definitely in New York, where you kind of have what would you call it? You would have sort of decorative employees, right? So employees that are kind of just there for show, because you pretty much like, okay, I'll just mention it. So psychiatry kind of does that. So sometimes what they'll do is like you'll have a psychiatrist here that'll employ therapists. So they don't do that because they actually want therapists. The reason why they do that is because they don't want to be labeled as a pill mill. And this is like a common practice here. Several people do it, probably way too many. So with that said, I wonder, is there a sense, and this is more of a, I guess, an opinion question and more subjective from your perspective. So is there a sense sometimes that like pretty much Tyson employs these people just as decoration? Because ultimately what they really do is, and I don't know what the percentages are here, obviously, but ultimately what they do and what they want is they just want cheap prison labor, and everybody else is kind of like there just for them to be able to say for a show, like, hey, here we hired these other people and we're not really just employing cheap labor.
Well, for me, the point I try and make in my book is the way that Tyson employs vulnerable populations, whether
Right.
that be undocumented people, whether that be imprisoned people, whether that be children, or even the story from Oklahoma of rehab centers, Christian rehab centers that were, you could either go to through a rehab program, or you could go work at the farm, which turned out to be Tyson.
Hmm.
And so I'm sure that in other states they've made, they have different programs, but it was interesting for me to look at the ways that they're forming these relationships with vulnerable populations, whether that be, people who are struggling with addiction, or people who are in prison, or kids, or, whatever it is.
Hmm. Oh, wow. Can you actually get into that? These Christian rehab or I guess rehabilitation networks or centers? How does that work?
Yeah, so this was an investigation by ProPublica, which is really my favorite news organization for
Mhm.
investigation. So it's just I didn't, I didn't investigate this. I came across their work when I was doing this, and I thought, this is so interesting, because it was interesting to me because Tyson frames itself as a Christian company. And there's a chapter in my book about, they have chaplains at every, every plant, or almost every plant, to provide, spiritual advice. And so I was like, okay, so they're making these relationships with other Christian organizations, in this case, a rehab. And what does that actually look like, that agreement?
Yeah. And so once again, right, it's kind of hard to figure out how they negotiate wages for these people.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many details that, I never had access to any paperwork. Anything I had access to was from workers, workers' medical records, or workers sharing documents with me. But from the Tyson side, I communicated regularly with the public relations director at Tyson for 4 years, there were 3 different directors. And so they could respond to, anything the points that I was investigating. But they sent responses like, Tyson does not have any doctors. That is not true. They're third-party providers, and things like that. So I didn't have, and workers would say, oh, I had to sign this legal document or that legal document, but they were never, they never had copies of anything. And so all the things that I know are stories, but I never, workers never had, could show me what it was.
Right, and the documents, at least anecdotally, were in English. If somebody spoke Spanish or a different language, they were just told, "Hey, you have to sign." And Victor, at least, who could make out some of it, with the basic English, understood. Okay, if you say something about this or you whatever, you'll be fired. Something like that. Yeah. Out of curiosity, what do you so I know that in like us talking about the problem so far with the either chemical leak, Crisco on the floor, materials that they're provided, either not fitting or just not being suitable. And there we could see what the potential solutions are. But like, I guess I just wanted to ask you, what do you think like a company like Tyson could actually do to improve conditions for their workers, for their employees?
Well, the structural issue, which Kamala Harris has made a part of her economic platform, she has said, we need to take on the consolidated power of meatpacking companies, because that is it's not Tyson. There's a handful of meatpacking companies that have been accused of both colluding to increase the price of chicken and meat, but also to decrease wages for labor. And so if we didn't have that consolidated, only a few companies, and in my book, this is evident when in the pandemic, workers are becoming infected with and dying of COVID, and the major meatpacking companies go meet with the Trump administration and say, you can't shut down our plants. You can't make us, do anything. We need you to declare that we're essential so that we can keep doing things exactly as we have been.
Right. I actually want to read. So I'm glad that that's the quote, because I actually want to read a passage which relates to that. So you wrote, President Donald Trump issued an executive order declaring meatpacking plants, quote unquote, critical infrastructure under the Defense Production Act of 1950. The order prohibited state health authorities from closing meatpacking facilities and provided legal cover from liability claims by employees disabled or killed by COVID. The order kept meatpacking factories, which were virus hotspots, open, but it didn't impose federal rules requiring companies to protect workers from COVID outbreaks. On June 15th, Governor Asa Hutchinson of Arkansas signed a limited liability executive order which protected businesses like Tyson from liability related to COVID-19. The order would make it almost impossible for employees or their families to sue Tyson for wrongful death, for example, if a loved one died of COVID. Lisa Pruitt, a University of California Davis School of Law professor, said workers were unlikely to know about the liability shield or understand its import. Pruitt explained the order, quote unquote, comes into play when the plaintiffs, like workers who are sick with COVID or who have lost family members, start shopping around for an attorney, and it's just one more barrier an attorney is going to consider before taking a case, because it'll have to be taken on in court. Whether these liability shields are enforceable is one more legal unknown to be litigated. Like, yeah, what the fuck? How is a person even supposed to know like whether or not? So here's right. The choice here is now, okay, do I take the risk and do I go with COVID, and do I pretty much in some sense maybe even shut the factory down because I get everybody sick, depending on the degree, or do I obviously, kind of risk it and stay home? So yeah, Alice, so can we now actually talk about some of the workers and then travails with COVID, some of the ways that they've handled it, some of the ways that they've been treated because of it, and just issues that came up for them?
Yeah, and COVID, I mean, one of the really shocking and interesting conversations for me was when Victor, when COVID arrived, he has 4 kids. He went to his supervisor and said, even though this was a time when Tyson was saying there are no, there's almost no cases, there's nothing to worry about. And he
Right.
said, look, I have 4 kids. He wanted to take time off from work just to prevent any kind of, infecting his children. And that's the conversation he recorded, in which the manager said, do you want millions of Americans to die of starvation?
Hmm.
And so the level of like shaming and blaming was really shocking for me, in that the company was framing it that way, which Tyson Foods took out a full-page advertisement in the New York Times and other major papers saying, we are feeding the nation. That was their message to the public, when the reality is, is making an incredible profit. Is that, was that something that we needed to be focusing on
Right.
in the pandemic?
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean the story, and I was telling Alan before we started filming, I mean the story is applicable to so many corporations, if not all of them. Because like what I love about it is it's not just a story about Tyson and about this little community in Arkansas. It's literally a story about rural America and even just more widespread America. So in terms of corporations, in terms of like let's say the political system, I want to actually piggyback on a question that you just asked. So in terms of a political system, in terms of increasing unions, increasing bargaining rights, so what can we as a, let's say on the grassroots as a public, what can we do? Because I don't think there's anything you could do to make these companies change as long as there's profit and competition involved.
Yeah, I mean, there's of course individual responsibility, which is, you can decide what you're buying and what you're eating. But overall, we need to focus on the structural, which is why I think it's important that we force this conversations with our vote, with what we're, talking about, because both parties receive money from the meatpacking, the lobbying industry, and in general have had kind of a hands-off approach to oversight. And so we need to, as a nation, we need to address the consolidation issue, because that's the only way, and it will be better for us. It will be better for our health. Meat will be more affordable. Workers will have better wages. Workers will have safer conditions. So the overall issue is, it's not Tyson, it's the consolidated meatpacking industry, and that we haven't addressed that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, as you were writing your book, and obviously as these people were going through these experiences and you were hearing these stories, did it feel like there was any, I mean, because this is probably a stupid question, but I am curious. Was there any sort of progress made along the time that you've been researching your book, like in any sort of way, or was it all just pretty stable all throughout?
No, I mean, what I hope comes across in my book is that, when I started the book, workers were, the workers that I started speaking to were scared to death to speak to a journalist, to me, to share their stories in any way, to be in public in any way. And over the course of the book, they begin to organize, they begin to, with Vince Ramos, that, they're learning about their rights. A lot of, a group of workers traveled to Florida, which was just an incredible experience, to visit the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which is, an organization of agricultural workers that's been around for 20 years, that has really successfully worked both politically and in terms of providing information to consumers to really change work conditions for agricultural workers. And so having Arkansas poultry workers witness that was key, because in Arkansas, it is such a hard environment for anyone trying to organize and for workers. And so they look at this incredibly respected, successful organization that has all these different campaigns and is out, in the fields providing education for workers about their rights. Even, an important part of it, they were teaching workers, because a lot of workers are illiterate. So they had all these different like theater and different ways of educating workers that weren't just written pamphlets.
Mhm.
And so workers came back from that, and currently they've been organizing, marching, and this has been Ceremos has been around the child labor issue, which I think is really important, because if it's not addressed, I think it's going to get worse.
Mhm. Yeah. And I guess what are your general thoughts on the government subsidies, right? Because the basic argument is that, well, if we subsidize, let's say, big agriculture, the idea is like we pretty much drive prices down. Kind of everybody wins, right? Workers get higher wages. Let's say people get cheaper food, etc. But I mean, a lot of times it doesn't seem to translate. So I guess what are your thoughts on it just more broadly?
Well, overall, I think we need, as a nation, we need to be questioning what we subsidize.
Hmm.
Let's be real and clear about climate change. The whole idea that we need to push and support as a nation, as a government, the endless consumption of meat. And in this case, it's often meat that is, produced in an environment in which it's not even
Yeah.
a healthy product, you could say.
Mhm.
The idea that we need this endless consumption and we need to support it because that's how, what we need to do as a nation, we need to rethink that. What are we doing about climate change? Why aren't we subsidizing small farmers or farmers who are, growing animals in an ethical, organic way? Because we do not need an endless supply of meat. And I know that people say, oh, many people can't afford expensive organic meat, but that is because of the way that we have favored welfare for corporations over living wages for workers. They could afford things if they had a living wage.
Right, right, right. Because I would say, and myself included, so most people don't understand that the reason why the less organic food is cheaper is literally because that's the ones that government subsidizes. So a lot of times we think, oh, well, like, it's probably the way it's grown or the way it's kind of produced, but it's actually not the whole story. Again, it's the government kind of favoritism that helps keep some food cheaper than others.
It is a favoritism, and it's why aren't we questioning that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Curious, what do you think about this may be going a little bit more into the future, but like robots, lab grown meat, stuff like that. How do you think that will impact the meat industry?
Well, I mean, it's been interesting for me because as I was finishing this book, lab grown meat was in the news,
Mm.
and some media organizations had asked me to write about it. And I thought, oh, I don't know why, I'm probably not going to write about that. But once I started researching lab grown meat, who is an investor in lab grown meat?
Hmm.
Tyson Foods.
Hmm.
And
Oh
that
wow.
I found really interesting for various reasons. First of all, because lab grown meat, there's a lot of money flowing in because it's being framed as the future of food.
Hmm.
But once again, it's an extremely expensive experiment. Biotech, the price of lab grown meat is really high, and
Hmm.
the energy use currently to produce lab grown meat is greater than that of animals, of chickens and cows, that are butchered. So it was interesting for me that it was being framed, when we're thinking of climate change and energy use, as the future of meat. When I'm thinking, why aren't we thinking beyond, why aren't we thinking, okay, endless meat consumption isn't the future. Telling everyone that they can eat all the meat that they want is not the future, and investing in that idea is also not the future. And so I saw Tyson getting into it because they knew there was a lot of money there.
Hmm.
And I just thought that was a very interesting move on their part.
I got
Hmm.
you. Yeah, and then so as we start to wrap up, I am really curious. So, Alice, because I want to actually talk about you a little bit, especially for our audience who may not be familiar with you and your work. So, can you tell us about who actually inspires you or inspired you to become a journalist, who continues to inspire you, and kind of just like the whole sort of milieu of what you do? How did you get into that?
Well, I grew up in, as I said, in rural Arkansas. And my parents were a part of the Back to the Land movement, which was focused on the idea of sustainability, growing your own food, really being self-sufficient, building your own house.
Mm-hmm.
And so that has really, that's my roots in terms of what I write about are really come from my childhood. I grew up without a TV and I read a lot. I knew I wanted to be a writer. I never knew how to make money or like, how do you do this?
Mhm.
So I got a degree in Spanish, and then I entered a PhD program also in Spanish with focus on Latin American literature. And so a lot of my literary influences are, my focus is contemporary Mexican literature.
Mhm.
So like Elena Poniatowska, who is a very well-known Mexican writer who's covered basically all of the social movements in Mexico for the past, 60 years. And I moved to Mexico City in 2012. I had a fellowship from the National University. And so I'm very, very much influenced by my love of speaking Spanish, of working in Spanish, and of Latin American literature. And I actually met Elena Poniatowska in the street, which to me is just a sign from the universe, that I'm on the right path. And I ran up to her and said, your work is what really influenced me to become a writer and to take that risk.
Wow.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. So there was a book that I read in college. So at the time I was really, really, really fucking libertarian. I was the pick yourself up by the bootstrap person. And so I remember reading a book for my English 201 class, so the second version of English. So we read a book by Barbara Ehrenreich called Nickel and Dime. That fucking book blew me away, man. So it's literally about a waitress who just can't seem to make ends meet, like no matter how hard she tries. And as you're reading the book, like you were saying earlier, you're thinking, okay, well, why doesn't she do this? Or why doesn't she do that? And you ultimately see her exhaust all of these different options, and still it goes nowhere. And you're like, oh my God, there's like no way that this woman can ever support her and her kids. So I'm curious for you, Alice, what are your, I mean, I'm sure you have thoughts, but like, what was Barbara Ehrenreich also somebody who influenced you?
She is, and
Yeah.
so the first funding that I got for the very first article that I wrote on this topic was from the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, which she founded.
Wow.
And so that's really significant for me for many reasons, because Nickel and Dimed is a book that influenced me. And because the Economic Hardship Reporting Project supports projects about rural America, I had a lot of trouble trying to get people interested in a story about meatpacking workers in Arkansas.
Yeah, and I'm sure she felt the same way about the stories about waitresses, and I don't remember the town where the person worked. And I remember even when so we were assigned the book, I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm gonna read a book about a fucking waitress. Like, what's the point of this? And then you get into it, and you're just like blown away by it, man. How hard the country makes it for just a regular person, man, who just like really was just working for. I don't remember exactly how many hours a week. I'm just gonna throw a number out. It was had to have been more than 40. But how hard it was for this person to make ends meet, despite the fact that she was a hard worker. Like all of these things that we say, we're like, oh no, well, if she just worked harder, things would be easier. She did all of that. It's still nothing. Yeah. All right. So, Alan, final questions for Alice before we wrap up.
If we wanted to follow you and follow your work, where could we find you? And of course, buy the book.
You can buy the book, which comes out on September 3rd on all major platforms, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Bookshop, if you want to support independent bookstores. And I have a website, which is under my name, alicedriver.com. And I am on Instagram. That's my only social media at the moment. I'm on Instagram under my name also.
Love it.
Awesome.
Alice, thank you so much, man. I got to tell you, so not only is this book incredibly inspiring, but all of the work that you do, it's really, really, really phenomenal and necessary stuff. Thank you.
No,
Thank you. I really enjoyed this conversation. So I appreciate you reading my book.
Absolutely. All right. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay, sounds good. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
All right. So that was awesome. So everyone, if you'd like to follow us, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter or X. We're at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe,
Hit the bell on YouTube.
And again, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.